Welcome to episode 1 of the Peace and Power Ukraine podcast. It's a place to discuss all aspects of policy related to Ukraine. In many ways, Ukraine sits at a crossroads of East and West, where history and freedom and totalitarianism really collide. So we want to thank you for joining us on this, the third anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, going back to February of 2022. I'm your host, Gary Marks. I hope to bring a lot more light than heat in this podcast as we dig in each episode and really have a conversation together with some of the best people in the area of public policy when it comes to Ukraine and all the various aspects that we can cover. For this inaugural podcast, I am joined by Dr. Eric Patterson, President and CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Dr. Patterson is a foreign policy expert, a longtime fighter of totalitarianism. Dr. Patterson previously served as president of the Religious Freedom Institute, where he led the organization's efforts to advocate for religious liberty around the world. Prior to that, he was the dean of Regent University, which is where we first met a long time ago, Dr. Patterson. His government experience includes White House Fellow at the State Department and for over 20 years in the Air National Guard as commander. He's an active scholar on the moral dimensions of national security and international affairs, as well as the author of 20 books. It's great to have you with us, Dr. Patterson.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me today, Gary.
So, Dr. Patterson, you just published an article in World where you explain how critical it is to understand the unique cultural identity of the Ukrainian people. And I think that's really at the core of the conflict. When you think about why Putin is focused on Ukraine so diligently as he is, it's because he hates that cultural identity of Ukraine. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I'd say that there's numerous reasons that Ukraine is a thorn in the side of Vladimir Putin by their very existence, without threatening in any way. One of them is this idea that the Ukrainian people are not a distinct group, despite the fact that the Russians have repressed them over and over again. So they must be a distinct cultural and historical and linguistic identity in some historical way, despite today speaking the same language, etc. But for many people, particularly in the south and east in the country. But when you think about it, what is it? Part of it is the desire for Russia to dominate the region. Part of it's the desire to have control over natural resources that are there. And part of it is to not allow countries that were formerly in the Russian or the Soviet orbit to lean more and more towards the West as democracies and as free market economies tied to Western countries.
So when you think about the elements of the fight and the reason why we're in this fight, a lot of people don't understand that there is a spiritual dimension to this, that in some ways this is really a holy war. Could you unpack that angle for us a little bit and maybe describe how then the communist history is woven into that? It's a bunch of different threads that all weave a very ugly tapestry, and that's part of this war.
Well, that's exactly right. There are religious and there are spiritual elements here on both sides. So on the one hand, Ukraine has, when it comes to just the religiosity of the people, the practice of faith, actual practice, not a cultural identity, but the practice of faith. The Ukrainian people have been far more religious over the past century than the Russian people. Maybe 5 to 1 in terms of population's religiosity. And this has been particularly true over the past 25 years. And what makes Ukraine quite unique and distinct is the fact that it has had dynamic denominationalism for many, many years. And what I mean by that, and I'm using a term from Jose Casanova at Georgetown University, is the fact that Ukrainian Greek Catholics live and worship next to Ukrainian Orthodox citizens, and they worship next to Baptists, Pentecostals, and many others, including the small Jewish and Muslim populations. And so that type of, if you want to call it religious toleration between different groups, and the fact that religious leaders were largely unified over the past 15 years in the drive for democracy and for pluralism, it makes Ukraine a very different place. In fact, a missionary sending place into Russia. In contrast, Russia has typically had in recent decades a very, very low level of citizen religiosity. But Vladimir Putin has used religious symbols and religious themes and practices and holidays and observances to buttress a new Russian nationalism, if you will, based on culture, based on the idea of Russia as a great empire from the past. And he's used religious elements in their diplomacy and in the building of this kind of new Russian patriotism, including the Russian Orthodox Church calling fighting in Syria and fighting in Ukraine some form of holy war.
Yeah, I think a lot of the West, in particular Americans, don't really perceive that Ukraine is much like the American Bible Belt. It's a very religious people, and there is great religious liberty in the land. And I would liken it, a little bit more to the American South, culturally in so many ways, and that's something that people have to realize that, in my trips and travels, three just this last year in 2024, I saw that firsthand and began to understand that. I know you had a chance you've been able to travel to Kyiv as well. Is that something that you experienced, that resonated with you as far as the people, the commonality between, they're much more Western and American, in their style?
Well, I've been told that before I got in there, I'd looked at the statistics and things, so I knew that Ukraine was much more had a higher level of religious adherence and religiosity, in other words, practice of faith, that there was a lot more differentiation between different religious groups, and yet they seemed to get along. But I didn't know what to expect when I got there, including that we had some people in the United States saying, Kyiv is just like Western European cities. You're going to see symbols of progressivism, such as transgender flags and when you get there. And I didn't see any of that in roaming around the city. Instead, I saw orphanages, I saw faith-based organizations, many, many churches, and people trying to not just worship in terms of Sunday or going to mass during the regular day, but what we also saw was people driven by their faith to serve the most vulnerable around them, whether they were missionary groups or they had groups from foreigners trying to help out, but the citizens themselves, driven by faith to protect their own, to care for the vulnerable. It was a beautiful sight.
Yeah. Some of our listeners, they might be familiar more with Israel and understanding the missile attacks there and the barrages and what they've faced for upwards of a decade or more, it feels like. And in my experience, and tell me if you felt the same, going to Kyiv and the number of times that I have, it's the same elements. The citizenry, they've got apps on their phones, they're tracking the missiles that coming in at night. It's something that they live with a daily basis. Was that your experience too? Can you compare the two?
Yeah, so I'm very glad that you brought this up, because rightfully, so many of our friends and allies across the West have recognized the wicked behavior of Hamas on October 7th and the scale of this disaster. And as we're taping this in the third week of February, just in the past 24 hours, Hamas has released the deceased bodies of prisoners that had been taken. And this terrible situation continues. And if you think about the scale, if that had happened to the United States, say in my hometown of San Diego, which is a border city, it would have been over 30,000 killed, 30,000 raped, killed, murdered, and another 10,000 people, boys and girls and moms and dads, taken as hostages and held. 10,000 in the American case. And I'm proud that many Americans have seen, they've been able to kind of get a sense of just how terrible this has been for Israel. But a very similar thing has happened in Ukraine. So Ukraine, a country of 40 million people, has had 6 to 8 million people have to flee the country. It has an army now of 1 million people, 1 million men and women trying to defend their country against the Russians, a country of more than 150 million people, so almost 4 times the size. And a loss of over 13,000 civilians, et cetera. Here's what's so chilling in that case, if we just do the numbers, is the Russians have deliberately stolen 20,000 Ukrainian boys and girls. And some of them they're giving
Mm.
into adoptive families and raising them as Russians. Others are being trained to hate the so-called Nazi Ukrainians to go back and fight. 20,000. Now you do the math. America's about 8 times bigger than Ukraine was before the war. 8 times. So if we had lost 8 times 20, 160,000 children kidnapped by a neighbor. How would we respond? You wouldn't be able to be moving towards peace until you came to some sort of resolution of the loss of 160,000 American boys and girls.
Yeah, that is just tragic and heartbreaking on every level when you think about the families that those children are related to and the mothers and fathers that are missing their children. And, as I understand it, they're taken to Russia to re-education camps, given to Russian families. Their cultural and religious identities are erased as much as possible. There is only one religious identity that's allowed, and that's a Russian Orthodox Church. So that's one of those elements where you see this holy war concept and how ideological this is as a conflict. And it's important to understand. Tell me, though, a little bit, you've been focused on your work with the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, this communist thread, and what might be driving Vladimir Putin's desires when it comes to his own past, growing up in the communist system, growing up and being a leader in the KGB. What is that part of it added to this fight and this unique conflict?
Well, Gary, thanks for mentioning our work at the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and Museum in Washington, D.C. And we have a set of programs, educational programs for students, and whether they're interns at our museum, or we take witnesses of communism, survivors, right into the classroom live or by video. We have,
and that's right downtown on
it's right
L Street?
Yeah, it's right at McPherson Square, 2 blocks from the White House in Washington.
Great.
But we deploy teachers and speakers all across the country. We have a video series of survivors of communism called The Witness Project, available on YouTube for free. You can buy our high school curriculum very inexpensively at Amazon, as well as other materials we have available from our website. So we do education, we do policy relevant research on places like Cuba and North Korea. In other words, today's threats. And of course, we have a role to play with the museum of being a testimony to the horrific crimes of the past, as well as things, whether it's Venezuela or Vietnam, that are going on today. And so thinking about that lens about communism, on the one hand as an ideology, but then second as a set of practices. When I think about Vladimir Putin, the things he talks about is he glorifies the power of the Soviet past and the glories of the power of the pre-revolutionary Tsarist past. And so I don't think that Putin, when it comes to the ideology of communism, is a fully fledged communist today. I don't think that he necessarily, as far as I can tell, sends his children or his grandchildren, I guess, to Karl Marx school anymore. But all of the tactics, all of the assumptions of the way that communism operates, in other words, it's driven by the state, that it's perfectly fine to use torture, to use intimidation, to cow your enemies or to get what you want. Marxism says that the means of production should be in the hands of the government. And certainly in Russia, that either the government or the cronies around Putin either control the economy or they can immediately intervene if they're not paid off. There isn't freedom of speech and religion and the right to assemble in things in Russia in the way that a democracy has. So that what I'm saying is the communist playbook, the top-down statist realpolitik, that the people at the center can do whatever they want and that the leader can be as ruthless as he wants to promote his agenda. That's the playbook of communism, and that's the playbook of Vladimir Putin.
Yep. As a guy with the last name of Marx, I'm obviously very sensitive and aware of that history, and I appreciate you unpacking that for us. When you think now, as we kind of pivot from the past and look to the present, and we have these negotiations that have begun, some on the rightward side of the spectrum, maybe the Trump end of the spectrum, have said, hey, we've got to stop and make sure we don't have these endless wars. And that's colored their thinking, maybe walking into these negotiations. Now, on the other hand, there are no American boots on the ground. There's nobody asking for American boots to be on the ground. This is very different than Iraq and Afghanistan. But I know that you are a soldier and somebody who's served over 20 years, and you have a perspective and understand the impact of when troops are sent. But this isn't that. So, how do we think about these negotiations unfolding with Putin? Maybe what security guarantees are needed for Ukraine to survive apart from U.S. troops?
Yeah. So let me say something really from kind of my scholarly work, and then maybe we can also talk a little bit later about how Ukraine might fit into a much bigger, maybe even global security architecture. But in my book, Ending Wars Well, and in some other work, I talk about the three elements that will lead to a long and enduring peace. The first is order, the second is justice, and then in some cases over a long period of time, you can move towards conciliation. And I've written about this specifically in terms of Ukraine in a set of articles for Providence Magazine in the spring of 2022, just as the war had broken out. Let's put justice, which I don't think we're going to see, and this idea of conciliation to the side for a moment. Just talk about order. And by order, what I mean is there a government that can provide basic services to its people? At the end of many civil wars or interstate wars, that's not always possible. That is Ukraine has that. Second, do you have a set of threats within the country that make it difficult for the central government to impose law and order? And of course, other than the Russian invasion, Ukraine doesn't face the types of armed cartels that Latin American countries face. It doesn't face drug smugglers like those countries. It doesn't face the Taliban or Al-Qaeda within its borders, terrorist groups. So it actually has domestic security if it hadn't been invaded by a neighbor. But then the third element of order is the idea, have you dealt with the immediate threats that are on your borders and coming to some sort of negotiated peace? And in the case of Ukraine, that really is what any negotiation has to be about. The last time that when I was there, people were saying in December, please give us a period, not a comma, meaning not a pause for the next attack, but a true and enduring security situation. And let me just remind the listeners that Russia over the past 15 years has attacked Georgia. It's had kind of a perfidious response to Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. It attacked Ukraine in 2014. It attacked Ukraine again in 2022. And that doesn't count bullying, cyber warfare, cutting undersea cables, blackmail of energy supplies, all of those types of things across the region. That's why Ukraine needs a enduring set of security guarantees to be able to go forward in the future and not fear another Russian attack next summer or the year thereafter.
Yeah. From what I understand in my discussions with Ukrainian leaders is they have also a longer period to think about this from a historical perspective. They don't just think of even the last 15 years of Putin's behavior. They think about their relationship with the Russian Empire going back, hundreds of years. Just in the last 120 years, they think about their history with, the communists taking over, the Holodomor, when millions of Ukrainians were starved to death with an intentional policy. They think about what happened in World War II, first taken over by the Nazis and persecuted by them, and then back again under communist rule. So there's so much baggage there. When they think about security guarantees, they are wanting not just, like you said, a comma, they're wanting a period. Is that fair to unpack the mindset and trying to be fair to their own history?
I think it is. And an analogous situation where we got to a situation of order after a devastating war, and it's only an armistice, but it is held to this day, is the way that the Korean conflict ended. Remember, the Korean conflict was a conflict where one side broke all the rules, broke its promises, attacked the other, and a UN-led peacekeeping force that was largely managed by the United States, but also, of course, had South Koreans, Australians, Brits, and many, many others in it, people from across Europe, did recover South Korea. And after 3 years of war, 2.5 years of war, 3.5 years of war, and 4 million dead, most of them civilians, the armistice ended the war. It created that demilitarized zone that's landmined between the two countries. There were a few other elements, but it didn't change North Korea. It didn't bring anyone to justice. And yet South Korea has been able to flourish over the past 70 years. And so there are ways to move towards an enduring security, but you have to have the external security guarantees by the West to guarantee that Ukraine, whatever the new map looks like, is safe. And that includes a security architecture that protects Poland, that protects Romania, that protects the other countries that are in the region.
So as we think about that situation, I think Ukrainians would be very pleased if they looked back in 50 years and saw, hey, they are like South Korea and experienced that level of freedom and prosperity for a long period of time. I think they would take that all day long. But in order to get there, we're going to have to see President Trump use leverage. At the moment, it seems like he's giving a whole lot of carrots and a lot of sticks, but there are sticks. There is U.S. leverage here. Help us understand that a little bit.
Well, there are areas of U.S. leverage just in the region. President Trump has asked for European countries, okay, are you going to step up? Are you going to put troops on the ground? France has said they would. The United Kingdom, to my surprise, said that they would put troops on the ground. And so you could imagine a situation with the U.S. providing financial and logistical support and weapons from behind, maybe doing training and things. For instance, the long relationship between the California National Guard within DOD and the Ukrainian, a relationship that goes back to the 90s, of every summer doing training and missions together. So you can imagine the Europeans providing the bulk of the troops on the ground. I believe Poles would be there. I believe that lots of other countries would, if there was the commitment by the United States to provide financial resources, to continue providing U.S.-European Command resources and NATO resources out of Stuttgart and whatnot. So I think that would be a possibility. The other thing that's there, though, is does the White House see this as part of a larger grand bargain? A grand bargain that might include, for instance, the Russians saying you can do whatever you want with Iran and stop it from its nuclear ambitions, stop it from its terrorism. We will not provide it with any protection. So imagine a scenario where it's a deal on Ukraine is less favorable to Ukraine, but from an American geostrategic set of interests, that the U.S. gets some other things, notably with regards to Iran, the Middle East, maybe some other places as well, maybe Russia agreeing to stop providing support to Venezuela or something in our own hemisphere. So I do think that there's some things that have not been talked about in the regular press that might play into a future deal.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Good point. Let's open that up a little bit more. It's my sense that there really has been a coalition of evil that's been working together, whether it's Russia working with North Korean troops in the Kursk region and bringing them into the fight, relying upon their partner in Iran to provide all these Shahid drones that they've been flying into Ukrainian cities and attacking Ukrainian families. You have China that has been part of this quietly thinking, okay, Russia and China, can we control the world's energy supply, rare earth mineral supply? Can that be an element that we need to think of? Can Trump walk into this and say, I've got to make sure that I have great partners with Ukraine, not only because I'd like to recoup some of what I've invested, but if Ukraine and the U.S. become partners on rare earth minerals and energy as a way to keep Russia and China from monopolizing those supplies, isn't that a huge victory for the West as we head in towards the next 75 years of this century?
Well, I think that that's right. There's a lot of ways that we've already had a few wins. The Baltic countries just in the past month have finally fully gotten off the Russian energy grid. That's Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Very pro-West, very pro-American, valiant fighters, although they're small populations. The move that even Germany has moved away from energy dependence on the Russians. And the United States, to quote President Trump, is ready to drill, baby, drill, and to provide at reasonable cost not only energy independence for itself, but lots of energy resources to its Western allies. And so that coupled with the raw earth minerals that Ukraine has, which are outside of Chinese control, the fact that Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe and of the Mediterranean in so many ways, having that oriented towards the West. These are all very, very, very positive things that will be wins for President Trump, alongside a strengthened NATO, because now Sweden and Finland are part of NATO, a strengthened alliance if these countries do finally bring up their spending commitments. Let me just say, it's kind of a reminder that 2/3 of NATO allies a decade ago were spending less than 2% of GDP, which is what they promised. Particularly during the President Trump era, where he was really banging this drum, we got it to about 2/3 of the NATO countries spending at least 2% of their GDP on defense. And now that he's back in office, already countries are coming forward saying, we're going to get that up to 2 or 2.5%. The Brits are at 2.4%, for instance, right now. And so this call for allies to carry their own weight may be a part of this larger set of things that come out of the negotiations.
Great. As we close out our time, Dr. Patterson, let me just ask you for one final question. Maybe give us your favorite story or your favorite experience from your trip to Kyiv this last December when you went. I know you were a lot of places, had many interesting meetings with leaders, but maybe what stands out as you unpack that time?
Well, I'd say that one of the things that's really stood out to me in recent years is the beautiful music. I'm a musician. I love music, and the beautiful music of the Ukrainian people and them singing their national, cultural, and patriotic songs together, and how visibly moved they are because they are at war. And it hasn't felt like that here in the United States. I'm actually quite thankful for that we haven't had to be in a war footing like we were after 9/11. But nonetheless, the sense of patriotism and courage that's expressed in their music is quite astonishing. I think just the second thing I would say is it hadn't registered with me until being on the ground, as it is in any war zone when I've visited Africa or Afghanistan. Parents who've lost children in orphanages that have lost their parents, visiting in a women's shelter, 17-year-old new mom, who it was an involuntary choice to become a mom, if you will, because she was in the hands of the Russians for a while, and to see the brokenness of people and yet the resilience of the Ukrainians. It's just been very, very valiant and very, very inspiring. And listen, Russia's an enemy of the West. The Ukrainians are they're a buffer state between NATO and Russia, or at least they have been. They're fighting a war for NATO's eastern flank. And so it's in our interests. And it's also, there's something very, very beautiful about this people just trying to defend themselves and asking for us to help them have the tools so that they can defend themselves.
Great points. Thank you, Dr. Patterson. You did remind me the Ukrainian people are a singing people above all else. Somebody told me they have more copyrighted songs than any other country per capita. So that's something I know you'll want to look into as well. But yeah, they are a singing people. They write songs. And no matter how difficult their history is and how precarious their situation might be, they continue to sing and have a heart and, are prayerful about having a just and lasting peace. I think all of us can agree and hope for that in coming months. So thank you for your time, Dr. Patterson, and thank you for all those that have joined us on this first episode of Peace and Power Ukraine. Please like and subscribe to this podcast, and we'll see you next time back here.